Again, thank you. Thank you, David, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for sharing your nap time with me. And I am very happy to be back on this beautiful ship where I come every year just to join the adventure. And this trip, of course, from Tokyo all the way to Shanghai is the original slow boat to China. Back in the old days, nobody would have taken this for pleasure, as they used to say. Anybody who goes to sea for pleasure should go to hell for a holiday. Well, it should get better as we get on because the weather is supposed to make its way to the out into the Pacific, and so we should have better weather as soon as we get through the inland sea of Japan and off to Korea. At least that's our hope. I myself have been working in Asia since the early 1980s. I first came as a young sailor and lived in Taiwan, Japan, and then China. And then I ended up working in China for many years. And I still go back every year to see the remarkable changes. I'm sure a lot of you have been there many times. And one of the remarkable things about Asia is that we know it has a great ancient culture, but it's also so dynamic. And every place you have been before and every place you go back to has something new to show you. And so even going back to places that seem to be familiar become a new experience if you have the time and the right auspices to go there. This trip is highlighting these various ports from Tokyo all the way to Shanghai. And I'm just going to talk about the first three ports and also go back a little bit to Tokyo just to give a little introduction to them if you haven't been there, or a few points about it so that it like my other talks will be mostly about China, and so this is Japan and Korea with their own special qualities, as it is said around here. One of the qualities of Asia in general is that it is fairly separated in nationalities by the geography, and I'm going to give in one of my later talks just an overview of the geography from North Asia to South Asia, because there's all of these protruding land masses, all these islands, and Asia in no sense was unified in the sense you could say Europe or even North America or South America are sort of a contiguous piece of land. But in Asia, all of these places have been divided either by water or mountains, and thereby there's not really a sense of pan-Asian solidarity by any means. The Asians consider themselves distinct nations, and they only happen to be geographic neighbors, but they often have very little to do with each other. I'm not going to go into the politics of that. I leave it to my distinguished colleague, Bernard Kalb, to talk about political qualities, but I'm going to just show you that today some of the qualities of the ports where we're going to be traveling. Now, of course, that's not on our itinerary unless you happen to go there the other day, Mount Fuji in Japan, but it is, if you come in by the sea on a clear day into Tokyo, Mount Fuji is one of the greater navigation sites in the world, because then you know you're headed right into Tokyo Bay. So here we are coming around from Japan, Tokyo, off on the south coast of Honshu, and then we'll go up into the inland sea. There's the other island of Shikoku, and then we go through the Kunmun Strait and then to Korea. Jeju is the island of the south, and then we'll go up to the peninsula in northeast China where Dalian is, and then to Beijing, Tianjin, and then down the coast to Shanghai, as you can see on a larger map. But right where we are is this few peninsulas, the Chiba Peninsula, and then where Yokohama is on the outside of Tokyo Bay, Izu Peninsula. I just put this in because there's a great deal more islands in Japan. This is the ultimate island nation, sort of like Great Britain. There's the island itself and then more islands and a very variegated coast and an ocean that is sort of raging around it. Now, of course, today we get a taste of it. There's particularly rough water where we are today on this outside Pacific coast on the Pacific side of Japan, because of, you can see that there's a shallow area, there's sort of an uplift of islands and low water all through this area. The Hiroshima current is running up the coast of Japan from the southwest to the northeast. It's a very strong current, and then when there's contrary winds or upwellings from the shallows and these islands. That's why this is such rough water here. We call it just confused water. If you go out and look at this, you'll see waves kind of kicking all kinds of directions. We are going all the way out around the island of Honshu and around Shikoku to get into Hiroshima. If we had more days, it might take 2 more extra days to go in the inland sea of Japan. We could go through all of the little islands all the way to Hiroshima, but that is navigationally much more difficult for a larger ship. So here is just Tokyo Bay, and that's the Izu Peninsula down on the lower left. Yokohama is one of the traditional entrances to Tokyo Bay, but this time we actually docked right there at the Harumi Island Terminal right in Tokyo Bay, so that was very convenient. How many of you spent a few days in Tokyo? Well, it's something not to be missed for those of you who've seen it before. It's always, there's something new to see in Tokyo. Now this is just one of those computer-generated graphics of the topography of this particular port. You see Tokyo Bay on the lower left, and then the mountains that rise to the south, and particularly Mount Fuji, which is one of the great mountains of the world. It's a pure conical volcano. All of the Japanese islands have been volcanic uplift, and then many mountains in a very rugged country. You know, it's mostly mountains and very little arable land relative to, let's say, mainland Asia. And of course, some of them are still tragically very active, some of the volcanoes in the north with earthquakes. But Tokyo as a city was built on this great plain around north of Fuji, and then on these river plains that came out of the mountains in central Honshu. So it's very densely developed, and Mount Fuji literally in Japanese means the mountain of fortune, which of course Japan has had in many ways and has its troubles. But it's certainly the symbol of the country, and particularly this area, the Tokyo region. This is actually Lake Hakone near Fuji, where they put up this rather elaborate European-style old cruise ship, curiously. Then there's the sea. This is the famous Hideyoshi illustration of the tsunami that could come in. But Tokyo Bay is fairly protected, even from a storm like today. It's a calm refuge, and that's why the city's there, because the coast of Japan is so rough in so many places. There are very few good harbors other than the inland sea and, of course, Tokyo Bay. The old capital used to be in Kyoto. I'm sure many of you have already been to Osaka, Kyoto, the Kansai area. That used to be the central administrative region for the nation, which has gone through various civil wars and upheavals over the many centuries. But when the capital was transferred to Edo, it was called back then, that became the eastern capital, and that is what Tokyo is today. Now that was done to unify the country under the shogunate, and then Tokyo became the center for both commerce and political life to this day as the capital of Japan. Originally it was a small fishing village on the bay. Here's an old fish market. And the Tokagawa Shogunate was formed out of the civil war and the battle between the different samurai groups that then led to the unification of the country under Ieyasu in late 1500s, early 1600s. Now there's some remains of that era even in Tokyo, with some of the old castles and fortifications typical of the time. And you have heard or seen movies about the samurai. All of them were required, all the nobility of Japan were required to keep a home in Edo, or now Tokyo, so that during the season they would be there under the purvey of the emperor, the shogunate, which is the military rule back in those days. So I have a few pictures of the old samurai. Now, of course, you can see all kinds of films and recreations of this era. But in Tokyo itself, there was also the what's called the Shitamachi, which was the low city down on the waterfront. Now, this is where we actually were docked and left what used to be, let's say, a thriving small markets and old town, particularly entertainment district, down on the waterfront. With geisha houses and tea houses and assorted, particularly comfort for sailors coming in. This is Hunky-Dory, which actually was the old red light and entertainment district in Yokohama, which has now been taken away. But that name comes from the sailors who would go visit Hunky-Dory on their leave ashore. Now, it doesn't happen anymore, I assure you. Now here's the sumo wrestling back in the olden days when it was done outdoors. Now, of course, they have big modern stadiums for it. But in one of them, I took this picture of these tremendous big sandals for one of these giant guys who was immortalized with his oversized sandals. Now, all of this old Japan changed, of course, when the Europeans and then Americans came and incurred into Japan and China, all through Asia. And at this time, you know, that Japan was an isolated country that refused any diplomatic relations or economic trade except what was allowed at the port of Nagasaki down on the farthest, most southern reach island of Kyushu. But Commodore Perry and the American squadron based in Shanghai, and as the American fleet in the Pacific, knew that if they came into Japan and threatened naval action, they could probably open it up for trade. Now, this is a period that is often vaunted, at least in American naval history, as the first naval diplomacy. But to the Japanese, it was considered a great humiliation because they first turned him away when he first sailed in. Then he came back and anchored in Tokyo Bay and said, if you do not meet with us and make a treaty and accept our letter from President Fillmore, then we will initiate a bombardment of the Emperor's palace. And at the time, the Japanese had very antique armaments and finally agreed after much discussion to make an agreement with Perry and then the outside world to open up the country. This is a particular interest to me, this history, because my middle name is Perry. I'm a distant relative of him, though I'm a merchant marine officer and I practice no naval diplomacy, only peace and prosperity. But what happened with that is that Japan then suddenly decided to modernize in the face of European and American Western technology. They had already seen in China that China had been invaded by English, French, and finally German, and everybody got a piece of China, including the Japanese finally. But Japan wanted to stay independent, so they made this agreement, and then the Meiji Emperor took over the reins of the government from the shogunate and then launched a campaign to educate and modernize and militarize and industrialize Japan, which has gone on to this day. That emperor is still vaunted as a great leader of the modernization of the country. If you went to the Meiji Shrine, you can see the memorials to that era. In this illustration, you have the imperial crest up on the top of the torii, which is the 16th leaf chrysanthemum. Now, old Tokyo was a low-lying city of many wooden buildings. This is the Asakusa Tower at the time, a water tower originally. It's no longer there. But you can imagine when the city was all one- or two-story buildings spread around the bay and very old-style Oriental city, very crowded. But then it went through a great transformation. I just list some of the key points of the era. With the war with Russia, 1905, the first time a European power had been defeated by an Asian power in modern times. That led the Japanese to colonize Korea, and a recent history book said that it was with the urging of President Teddy Roosevelt, who thought that the Japanese would be the best partner of Asia to modernize and then create let's say, a peace and a prosperous Asia that would work with Europe and the rest of the world, and the Americans. Then the Japanese went on to get more resources in Manchuria and then continued to incur and then finally have war and invade China, which led to the embargoes and sanctions from Europe. And, the Japanese went through an alliance with the Axis powers, and that led to an American embargo on Japan that led to the attack on Pearl Harbor. If you get a chance, there's a recent Japanese movie called Admiral Yamamoto, which details in detail the calculations of the military and the Navy and the objections that Yamamoto had against the war with America. Even though he led the attack on Pearl Harbor, he disagreed with it, but as a military officer, he went ahead knowing that it would end up as the destruction of the country. But you can see that movie if you want. Then the Japanese, of course, took over much of Asia in what they call the prosperity sphere, which is an ironic phrase considering they did it better by peaceful means than by military. Then defeat in 45, and then renewal. And I put the last question here, the stagflation. In the last 10, 15 years, Japan's had a very highly indebted and slow growth economy, but nonetheless is still one of the most prosperous countries in the world with a very strong currency. and of course it has recent trouble, though, to overcome. Now, I show you just a few pictures you've seen of the surrender on the Missouri and Tokyo Bay. My grandfather was actually aboard as an American officer from China. Subsequently, my own father was a young officer on General MacArthur's staff, and my parents are actually married in Kamakura. So we have some Japanese experience in our family. This is the shrine. I don't know if you want to see. It's near the Imperial Palace, the Yakatsuki Memorial to the War Dead. The imperial family, as you know, continued on with the current, current royal family. Have had children, and so curiously, MacArthur, as a political decision in the American government, allowed Japan to keep their imperial structure under constitutional monarchy. So right in the center of this vast city is still the Imperial Palace. You may have gone to see it, with the private grounds of the royal family, including rice terraces, which the emperor himself for the first harvest in the Confucian rite for a good prosperity for the country. And this is right in the middle of this great modern metropolis, and the mega city that is Tokyo. That's the Tokyo symbol flag there. But this city has some 20 million people in the outlying area, so it's one of the great urban complexes of the world. Not a very scenic city in many ways. Actually, from out on the river, it's pleasant, but otherwise in the city it's often a great maze. And after much of the destruction by the bombing in World War II and other earthquakes, it's been built up in kind of a haphazard way. Now they've built another one of these towers, the Sky Tower 3 they call it, another great kind of overlook tower. And then the city has had a great infrastructure boom with all of the roads and bridges. We went under this one on the way out to make it this site of modern development. Did anybody go to this fish market, the Tsukiji Market? That's where at dawn they auction off the tuna and all the catch from around the world. And it's as fresh as they can freeze it, I'd say. But Japan being an island nation, of course the great meal is fish and rice, sushi, sashimi, that you're familiar with. And to stay in Japan, as maybe some of you lived here, the transportation system is better than any place on earth, perhaps, with the trains and this is the Shinkansen, so you can get around Japan. You really don't need a car. And, I travel throughout Japan just by these kind of public, what makes it a very efficient. Then you have the political centered in the parliament and a few government houses, Ginza, if you went there, where the shopping centers are, and then areas for commerce and business, Marunouchi, Shinjuku. These are very dense, so that even if you're from a big city, going to Tokyo and then perhaps Shanghai, in contrast, are among the most urban parts of the world. And so never have desired to be rustled in a. This is why we're here. And a lot of the new developments, though, are very spacious, with a lot of plaza parks, and even in the midst of this big city, there's traditional Japanese gardens. This is the Tokyo City Government Building, and there's a lot of, let's say, iconic architecture. This is sort of like La Défense in Paris. This is one of the Telcon buildings, the Fuji building. So if you're interested in architecture and urban planning, Tokyo is certainly a place to come and see some of the best of it. Though if you look over the city, it's almost hard to tell where it is because it's just a big sprawling forest of such throughout this broad plain. This is the new convention center. There's also a lot of new art museums, a lot of new things always in Tokyo. Even in the midst of its recession, it continues to build. Then there are beautiful parks, and of course we just missed the Sakura Cherry Blossom Festival. And there's a bit of old Japan still in Japan, in Tokyo, even though it's not the place where you go to traditional culture or the architecture like you do in Kyoto or Nara, or smaller cities of Japan are a little more typical. But even in Tokyo, if you go to this Asakusa temple, you'll see the traditional Shinto and Buddhist torii and then the temple bells. And we will see plenty of temples on the cruise on our shore. Here's the goddess of mercy, And then you have in Japan also a lot of kami, they're called the little spirit, or Shinto, essentially a anime tradition of water, mountains, trees, everything has a spirit. These are often depicted in smaller structures, even mixed in with Buddhism and then Confucius tradition. This is the Daibatsu, or the great Buddha in Kamakura, where my parents were married, and that was my father's best man, he always tells me. And in Kamakura, though, they've actually a traditional town. So in the midst of all this booming economy, there's always a little piece of been preserved in our for the future to remind the modern, the ancient is. Here's what taiko drummers performance, originally done as a juvenile delinquent training, which is probably a good idea, but now they're internationally famous performers. Then the Koki and the No are the traditional opera and literary theater. Right near the Ginza is Kokiza. But the presentations go on for 4 hours, during which they'll serve you a box meal at your seat, and talking throughout the show, different than the hush-hush of a European theater. And then there's also some puppetry, though the national theater for that is in Osaka. And my wife is actually a professional puppeteer, so she went and studied with the master and then performed this, even though they're not allowed to teach Japanese women, a foreign woman, to learn. But that's a tradition of that is still amidst this country. But it's also a country of a lot of exuberant modern, from Godzilla to the other versions. And now we're going to be going down into the inland sea to the city of Hiroshima. Now this is a city upon the north side of the second big, other than Tokyo, and it means in Japanese the wide island, which is placed on all of these islands as a commercial from antiquity, now a modern industrial center. And if you're interested in my nautical part of the entrances to Hiroshima, and we'll go and around hundreds of islands, it's very difficult to get into. It's never become a major shipping port. The size of the vessels can't really get into it as easily. If you ever have a chance to see Japan, sea passage, and of course the heart of the country in olden days. Now, Hiroshima was and the castle, similar to Osaka Castle, not quite, with different gardens. One of the tours just does go to the Shokain with its bridges and its bonsai islands and beautiful Japanese garden. But of course, Hiroshima is famous for this building, which was actually a commercial office building and an exposition, the Genbaku Dome, and that was right on the central district on the waterway, and the prime city when Japan was modernizing. Of course, it remained the dome, now known as the Atomic Dome, at August 6, 1945. Of this, this is still a painful memory here, and discuss this at the bar, whether it should have been destruction of Hiroshima, not end to the terrible war, and it's still a good question whether that ended the war. Nonetheless, it somehow didn't get down with all the rest of the city. Remained as a monument to peace and to the memory of those 83 who died instantly. So many other, they figured the whole toll was about 140,000 over the time people died of radiation poisoning. But this has led Hiroshima to be sort of a shrine for a nuclear disarmament. At the shrine, there's a flame that they say they'll keep lit until all nuclear weapons are finally abolished. We would ever be so fortunate of that. These are the origami paper cranes that people leave at the shrine. So this is my people. Otherwise, it's really Japanese with dense business and space for people to live. Japan, cities and the has avenues and a lot of shopping areas and parks. This is one of the covered shopping areas, which you'll see they arch over the former pedestrian lane. And like they have distinctive local cuisine, a kind of a where they'll put food, beef sprouts, tofu, and then an omelet on the street with it. And this is a popular Hiroshima. The other thing, the carp team versus Hunjin Tigers and all the other teams around the country. So curiously, the American led to a baseball mania. And a little piece of culture is the anime, the manga. The youth of Japan are a phenomenon from their elders, and that there's a lot of pop Kanoko, the youth who were rebellious of various home. And so if you think generation, it's nothing like quite like Japan. So we'll see how the future. And then I'll leave just a few little from the area. This is what they call our trip, where English is a lovely language because every there's one reason the Japanese are very resilient, because they have known these disasters in the cities. Some pictures recently taken by the interview of some of the people in the region who now have lost had to move away, and so the sorrow faces have life working off his fisherman farm. This woman has some regret. And then same the disaster of the Fukushima plant not been cleaned up, even the cool. And now all of the nuclear generation has been mothballed down for inspection. Just the other day, there was warm for the year, and they will be electricity for run conditioning industrial. Some of the nobody knows it was really a disaster. Japan will get through. Now, Japan just said have been there before. Foreigners come to, and they go, and they don't get to stop. It is a very and history of long history. He's always called it a dagger in the country. Mongols and others always and because the Strait of Japan, the will cross over. But the island of Asian continent is there have always been, have historically been the Chinese or the Mongols, and so and overall a career. And the Japanese and the government assigns to real Korea and the after leading You can read it, go into the details. Meaningful, but I'll just show you a little bit of Korea. Of course, we're going to the south, there, the strait they call it Korea, in Japan, and has business with Japan. Jeju Island is down there further south that I'll talk about. Korea had thousands of years in the Confucian fashion, and a number of kingdoms. So the versus the south, many countries, antiquity belong, and then forcibly unified or not. It's called the because of Korea was a China and would contribute to trade. Korean people allowed to travel. Any foreigners allowed Korea. The march began really when the Japanese invaded and took Korea in 1910. But illustration of some of the Mandarin scholars who run the court, and they have typical ceremonial hats and creation of the ceremonies in the palace is. We're not going up, but I'll Chris, how to try to be both China and Japan. Language, and this is an illustration of calligraphy, and that's good. Were invented in development history, even though the official language was classical Chinese. In Chinese, and you have Hangul, but this is the Koreans are an island linguistically, Japan and much less Russia or other. The Koreans, by adopting their own language, became nationally still mother language. So they typically learn Chinese or Japanese, and now they learn many other languages. It is in the world because they've been around by everybody. Very proud to have now of individuals. Here's a of times run then and set up dynasty. Example done in Korea of their call. It's not written in it's probably by but up on the border on Korea, the lake a lockdown street. In this situation was released at true. It was, no way strict control of but often referred to in literature as the center of the country, this great lake up in the north. Now we're going to be down in the tropical. Then we're going to be crossing the sea up to Dun. there, Yellow Sea. I found this illustration which shows her Wills to sea, which gives a lot of mineralization, rich fish around high sea to China. You'll see it's just full of fishing vessels, particularly with, and that's why this area is very mountainous and the soil is, and this is the southern coast of Korea, the prosperous part of the by trade industry. That's with the beach. Inside a lot of different pictures with of course, you don't want to go navigation, but it, there are thousands of through the south coast of Korea. The shipping and shipbuilding is the major industry. Bhutan is on the town, old city. City, and town is where right downtown. Actually, to move all of to the city, make a let's say walking park water from the city. Pedestrian, uh, organic people because they get so hot. Like, was one of the, you see that big stole my beer. Development, the air from commercial, but it's and last time I was took us to art museum. Now this career, not sure. It's both very modern and then it's political history. The art is called this way. Then it's out to what burial ground. Now, sad. This war is not true. It's actually it is at a ceasefire. No spawn. some different countries. The that to another discussion because we're the more than the day. I sleep, but take because here he is. And you say you've been to Chile. Maybe they have, but it's our trip around. I'm going to be on support in Kenja and as having dinner, drinking, and my pleasure.